Hey everyone, I'm Jack and welcome to the show.
I'm Elena.
It's great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about listening skills in English today, which I know are something that can be a real challenge, especially when you're first starting to learn the language.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we want to keep things fun and easy.
That's the goal.
We're going to focus on 5 common mistakes that English learners make when they're trying to improve their listening.
Mistakes that I'm sure we've all made at some point.
Oh, definitely. Even though you teach English, I'm sure you've run into some of these yourself.
Oh yeah, all the time, especially when I'm trying to learn a new language myself.
So you make mistakes too.
Oh, for sure. Just because I teach English doesn't mean I'm perfect. For example, I've been learning Italian, and even with all my language background, it can still be tough to understand sometimes.
So you're not just passively listening for hours and magically understanding everything.
No, not at all. It's definitely not that simple.
I think a lot of people have this idea that listening is just something you can do in the background.
I think so too, but it's really not like that. You can't just sit there and let the language wash over you and expect to understand everything.
It sounds like you're saying listening is about more than just hearing words.
Yeah, exactly. It's about really paying attention and trying to connect what you're hearing with what you already know.
So it's about using all of your language skills, like speaking and reading and writing.
All those skills work together to help you understand what you're hearing.
So what would you say is the first mistake that people make?
I think a lot of people treat listening as a skill that's completely separate from everything else, but that's just not how it works.
So instead of just listening to a podcast, for example, what are some things that people can do to be more active listeners?
Well, one thing you can try is describing what you're hearing. Like if you're watching a video, pause it every minute or two and try to explain what happened in your own words.
Even if you can only say a few sentences?
Right, it's just about practicing. Another good idea is to do your grammar exercises while you're listening to something in English.
That way you can see how the grammar rules are actually used in real conversations.
Exactly.
So mistake number 1 is thinking that listening is a separate skill. What's the next mistake people often make?
I see a lot of students trying to listen to really long audio recordings. Like they think if they listen to a 40-minute podcast every day, they'll suddenly become fluent.
Yeah, we've all been there, thinking that more is always better.
It's actually much better to focus on shorter audio clips and listen to them multiple times.
So it's kind of like lifting weights?
I like that analogy. You wouldn't try to lift the heaviest weight right away. You'd start with something lighter and do more reps to build up your strength.
So what kind of short audio clip should people start with?
I'd say something that's only 3 to 4 minutes long. Listen to it a few times in a row. The first time, just try to get the general idea, then listen again and try to pick out specific details.
Maybe even write down some key words or phrases as you listen.
That can be really helpful.
So it's really about quality over quantity. What would you say is the third big mistake when it comes to listening?
I think a lot of people get hung up on trying to understand every single word.
I know I've been there. It can be so frustrating when you hear people speaking quickly and you feel like you're missing half of it.
Well, it's important to remember that even native English speakers don't understand every single word all the time.
So what's the goal then?
The goal is to understand the main idea, not every little detail.
Okay, so how can learners avoid getting bogged down by all those words they don't understand?
One thing you can try is slowing down the audio speed. Most audio players have that feature.
I use that all the time, even when I'm listening to podcasts in English.
Yeah, it can be really helpful. Another tip is to pay attention to the words that are stressed.
Because native speakers tend to put more emphasis on the important words.
Exactly. So you're training your ears to pick out those key pieces of information.
And not worry so much about the little filler words.
Right. You're focusing on the words that carry the most meaning.
This is all great advice. What about the fourth mistake? What do people need to watch out for?
A lot of learners forget about background knowledge and vocabulary.
Oh, that's so true. I remember one listener asked about understanding sports commentary, and I realized that even if your English is good, if you don't know anything about the sport, you're going to be lost.
Yeah, it's like trying to listen to a lecture on quantum physics if you've never taken a physics class. It's just not going to make sense.
So what can people do if they want to understand something specific like sports commentary?
It's really helpful to learn the vocabulary related to that topic and to read about the rules and strategies of the game.
So you're building that background knowledge.
Exactly. The more you know about the subject, the easier it will be to understand what you're hearing.
So it's almost like you're building a mental framework to hang all those new words and phrases on.
Okay, Lena, we've covered 4 common mistakes so far. What's the last one we need to talk about today? The last mistake is giving up too quickly and losing motivation. Learning a language can be tough.
Especially listening. It can feel like a really slow process.
It definitely can. So it's important to set realistic goals and celebrate those small wins.
Because we can be really hard on ourselves, right?
We can. Don't expect to understand everything overnight. Just focus on making small improvements over time. And remember to be patient with yourself.
So how can learners stay motivated when it comes to practicing their listening?
Well, one of the best things you can do is choose content that you enjoy.
If you're interested in what you're listening to, you're more likely to stick with it.
Exactly. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
That's a great message to end on. Learning should be enjoyable. We'll continue our conversation after a quick break.
And it really can be fun if you find the right stuff.
So we've been talking about these 5 common mistakes when it comes to listening.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing you want people to remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that improving your listening takes time.
It's a process, for sure.
It really is, and it's not like you'll just suddenly understand everything perfectly.
Right.
There will be times when you feel like you're not making any progress.
Let's all hit those plateaus.
But the key is to keep practicing.
Keep at it.
Yeah. Try different things and see what works best for you, and just be patient.
Don't get discouraged.
It's more important to make progress than to be perfect.
You know, we all make mistakes even in our own language.
That's so true.
Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I want to leave you with a question. What are some of your favorite English audio or video resources? What makes learning fun for you?
That's a great question because there really are so many resources out there these days.
There are.
Podcasts, YouTube channels, movies, TV shows, music.
So many options.
It's all about finding things that keep you engaged and that you enjoy.
Definitely.
So once you find those resources, remember what we talked about. Be an active listener. Don't just listen passively.
Right.
Break things down into smaller parts, repeat the tricky section.
Good tips.
And remember to celebrate your progress.
It's important to acknowledge those wins.
You know, when I was thinking about this episode, I realized that listening isn't just about the words themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean?
Well, it's also about understanding the rhythm of the language, the way people use their voices to express different emotions.
Oh, I see.
The pauses, the intonation, the little sounds we make.
Yeah, sometimes the way something is said can change the meaning completely.
Exactly. Like, think about sarcasm, for example. Someone might say, oh, that's just great. But if they say it in a sarcastic tone, they don't really mean it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example. So how can learners get better at understanding those more subtle cues?
I think it helps to pay attention to how native speakers use their voices, their facial expressions, their body language.
Like you're listening with your eyes, too.
Exactly. Have you ever heard of a technique called shadowing?
Oh, yes. Shadowing is a great way to practice listening and speaking at the same time.
How does that work?
Basically, you listen to a recording and you try to repeat what you hear. You try to copy the speaker's rhythm and intonation.
So you're almost trying to become a vocal chameleon.
I like that. It helps you internalize those natural patterns of speech.
So as you get better at shadowing, you can start to anticipate what the speaker's going to say next.
Yeah, it's like building mental pathways.
Are there any other tips?
Well, when you're first starting out, don't be afraid to use transcripts or subtitles.
Oh yeah, those can be helpful.
They can, but it's important not to rely on them too much.
Right.
Once you have a basic understanding, try listening without them.
Push yourself a little.
And the more you practice, the easier it will become.
Muscle memory for your ears.
You could say that.
This has been so helpful, Elena.
You're welcome.
I'm sure our listeners are feeling much more confident about improving their listening skills now.
I hope so.
Any last words of wisdom?
Just be kind to yourself, enjoy the journey, and keep listening.
That's great advice. Thanks for being here today, Elena.
It was my pleasure.
We've talked about a lot of techniques and tips to help people get better at listening.
We have.
But I think there's something else that's really important.
Oh, what's that?
It's your mindset.
You mean like having a good attitude and believing that you can improve?
Yeah, that's part of it. But I'm also talking about being curious about the language. Being open to hearing new sounds and new ways of speaking.
I see what you mean, like being a detective trying to solve a mystery.
Yeah. And the more you listen, the more clues you pick up.
You start to notice patterns and how things fit together.
Exactly. It becomes more and more interesting the more you learn.
It's a fascinating process.
Well, Lena, this has been a really helpful conversation.
I'm glad you think so.
I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, remember to be patient. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Have fun with it. Keep practicing your listening, and you'll be amazed by how much you can improve. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.